Okay, welcome you all to yet another class or lesson on this the module of Crew Resource Management or CRM. And this lesson is about communication in general. We already learned how important and how communication amongst people, individuals, becomes the bare, fundamental interaction between individuals and exchange of thoughts, etc. And therefore, this aspect is very important, and so it is important for us to learn little bit of the theory of communication. So in this lesson, I'm going to talk about the theory of communication is in little bit more detail. Okay, what is communication? Communication is a process of meaningful interaction amongst people. We are talking about people. Of course, several other living beings also communicate amongst them, and so we are not going to here it's specific to human beings communication. Communication process involves transmitting information from one to another with an idea of conveying thoughts and idea from one person to another. Of course, there is an ultimate motive to influence the action or in some way to modify or influence the other person's thoughts or expect conditioned behavior or there are several other things to communication, which is what this lesson is all about, and so we are going to learn this in detail. What is the essence of communication? It's a personal process. It occurs between people. It involves change in behavior, and it's a means to influence others thoughts, others behavior, others beliefs, etc. Expression of thoughts and emotions through words and actions, and it's a tool for influencing and controlling other behavior. Probably that's the ultimate aim. That's what is the basic motive. And of course, it's a social and emotional process. And that's what is essence of communication. Very often understand or realize communication as only as verbal communication, which is so now that we are at the theory part of communication, let's go over what are the uh, different ways to communicate. First is written communication, verbal communication, visual communication, and gestures communication. So all these are methods to convey across a feeling or convey across an idea, convey across a, a, philosophy, or convey across a thought to the other person. So there are several ways in which we can communicate our thought processes. That's what this means, and I want you to understand. Let's see the process of communication. Of course, that's as I've always been telling. There is a goal. There is a purpose behind why someone wants to communicate something to others. Uh, we have often repeated it, so I will not repeat it. But there is a goal. There is an ultimate aim. So let's go over the process. Firstly, there is a sender of the message. And there is a medium by which the sender sends the message. As we saw, there are different ways to communicate things. So he uses one of the mediums or multiple mediums together to send a particular message. Now, at the other end is the receiver. Now the receiver will try to grasp or try to understand the sender's message. Now you must appreciate that there was an intention by the sender, but whether the intention fully has been conveyed or no, we are really not very sure. The receiver may well have understood something slightly different from what the sender may have originally intended to convey across. So, how will the sender come to know? By way of feedback. So, that way the loop is complete. The communication loop process, the process is complete, and so now the sender can modify his methods to send the actual message if it has not been understood in its original form. So this remains a general process, and of course there are barriers to this entire process. It depends on the intelligence level of the sender, or the intelligence level, or how well the receiver received, or in what physiological condition, whether he was able to hear the message properly, and there are several factors, and each medium we must understand has got its own limitations. However good a person may be good in writing, there are there are limitations to convey across his full essence. Uh, that's why we see there are some very good writers. Why we call them good writers? Because they are able to convey across their feelings and what they want to convey across in much greater detail. Similarly, verbal communication has got its own flaws, that depending on the words which the sender uses, the receiver may sometimes may understand it entirely differently. It's possible, and it has happened. And we will see how such misunderstandings have led to, in fact, even accidents in the aviation background, or in the aviation scenario. Okay, there's something called 7 C's of communications. That is the clarity, concise, concrete, correct, coherent, complete, and courteous. I'm not going to go through each one of them in any great detail because most of them is well understood by individuals, and I've given detailed notes in the notes which are adjacent to the lesson. So I will uh, expect you all to go through the lesson in detail if you need clarification on any of these aspects. And as I told you, there is a purpose behind any communication process, and unless the result is achieved, the communication cannot be called effective. So, what is an effective communication? It serves the purpose of elicit change in general action, create understanding, or inform or communicate a certain idea or point of view. And I'm sure you all understand this. I don't have to go this aspect in greater detail. Go over some aspects of non-verbal communication. Firstly, the written communication. Of course, I have stuck to airline environment, which is but it is applicable to all the all business environments, are all organized organizations, etc. So, in an airline environment, the documents are standard operating procedures, manuals, operating orders, notification letters, etc., etc., and pre-flight briefing folders, NOTAMs, weather briefing, number of passengers. Of course, these are all interaction between the operational staff and the crew, and some of them between the cabin crew and the operation staff. So several written forms of communication take place in airline environment. Apart from verbal and written communication, there are other ways of communication of or non-verbal communication, which are sometimes very very effective and very and convey sometimes very strong feelings of the conveyor. That's your appearance and bearing, your body language, your facial expressions, the body contact, the shake hands or eye contact, etc., etc. When I was working in an airline, I would often advise young pilots that as they walk through the several sections where check-in and several areas through the airport, they should just tap on the shoulder of other some of his co-workers, which is very very effective in promoting cohesiveness amongst the group or within your airline. So many of them appreciated such advice, and the point which I am trying to make is non-verbal communication is sometimes can be extremely effective. Uh, Verbal communication remains by and large the most used and most happening communication amongst individuals. So let's go over the a little bit more in detail. Successful communication involves the communicator's ability, and it's the full responsibility of the communicator to ensure that the success of the process is ensured. And the communicator should understand the barriers to communication and makes efforts to overcome all those barriers and takes feedback to ensure that the message has been conveyed across. There are different kinds of individuals. There are some shy individuals. Becomes the communicator's responsibility to take feedback from people and finally achieve what he wants to convey across. Does not absolve the receiver in completion of the process, obviously. So the communicator will try his level best, but the receiver also has a role to play in the process. When does verbal communication fail? Let's see. When some uncommon language or phraseology is being used, physiological reasons, there is some problem in the loudness, or the person who is receiving is distracted by some other noise or any other distractions. Failure to plan clear communication, that means that you not planned it well, or failure to listen by the listener, failure to demonstrate understanding, that means the receiver has not demonstrated, he has not shown full involvement in completing the process of this communication. Congruence between verbal and non-verbal communication, that means you are conveying a different gesture, but you are talking some other words, so then there is an incongruence, and so it's not going to be conveyed in its full essence. How to ensure that verbal communication is successful? We must use a common language and phraseology. Stress the urgency and importance. That means your tonal variation should be able to convey across the importance of the message to be conveyed. Choose the correct time and place. Plan your activity well. Uh, test the understanding by rehearsing it prior, if the message is to be that is to be conveyed is very important. And of course, keep verbal non-verbal communications in congruence. So get to more specific kind of communication, that is the interpersonal communication. So let's see some aspects. Interpersonal communication happens every moment. It is characteristic in aviation. It is an important aspect in the cockpit. This is very important. We are going to see it a little bit more detail in our next lesson. Good interpersonal skills are essential for successful conduct of flight operation. Good interpersonal skills will mean that good interpersonal communication skills as well. Some aspects of interpersonal communication which I will not go into the detail because it's fairly self-explanatory. It is inescapable, it is irreversible, it is complicated, and it is contextual. So these are the salient aspects of interpersonal communication which we need to be aware. Most, let's understand it is irreversible, so we have to be very careful, especially when dealing with strangers and new first time when you are meeting, when you don't understand each other's personality, when such a time when communication takes place, so an impression is getting formed. So these are all irreversible, so we need to be cautious of it, understand it, and be careful. Okay, we discussed about barriers to communication. Here, the barriers to communication are language, in some language, accent, and etc. In my earlier airline, we had the people from 42 different nationalities. They came from different backgrounds, so the way they would speak was entirely different from each other, and it was a challenge to go through the operations. Nevertheless, it was interesting and it was a good learning process for all of us. Psychological, uh, physiological barriers. Psychological is depending on the mental ability of the sender and the receiver. If somebody is a good communicator, he is able to communicate his ideas well, and physiological is somebody's hearing capability and his background educational capability. So that also affects affects the communication process. Of course, physical is almost similar to physiological. Physical, sometimes you are close by to the sender, but if you are standing far away, you may not be able to grasp the communication. It's possible like that. Systematic and attitudinal barriers. Systematic is what is existing in the system. Uh, it could be space constraint in a newspaper, or it could be space constraint in a paper written communication. It could be time constraint in case of verbal communication. So these are all systemic issues, and they act as barriers in communication. Attitudinal, of course, it depends on the individual's attitude to everything. That's something which is very important, that then we need different ways to handle such issues. Some tips to improve the body language: keep appropriate distance, touch only when appropriate, take care of your appearance, be aware that people may give false cues, and maintain eye contact that imposes your personality, and that way your communication process could be much effective. And of course, smile genuinely. You have to develop your own personality to improve your own body language. Let's go over some do's and don'ts of good communication process. Think ahead before speaking. Use simple words and phrases. Increase your knowledge on all subjects. Speak clearly and audibly. check twice with the listener whether you have been understood accurately or no. More do's for effective communication. In case of an interruption of what when you are speaking, if some observer listener had to ask for a doubt, and if you had to interrupt your process in between, it's always a good idea to have a little recap of what has already been said, so that the people who are a little bit behind also can catch up, or you are able to bring all the listeners on one platform. Always pay undivided attention to the speaker while listening. This is for the listener. While listening, always make note of important points. These are do's for listeners or those who are receiving the communication. Always ask for clarification if in doubt. Repeat what the speaker has said to check whether you have understood accurately or no. And of course, if the person who is conveying the message, if in a class, if there is a doubt which has been raised by a listener, the same has to be repeated so that the entire class knows what is the doubt of the person who asked the doubt, and then thereafter the clarification. Some don'ts. Uh, don't react and mutter something in anger. Don't use technical terms and terminologies not understood by majority of the people. Speak too fast or too slow. Too slow speaking could be distracting. Too fast could leave out some of your audience. Speak in an inaudible surroundings so that you will not be heard. These are the some of the don'ts. Okay, some more don't assume that everybody understands you because of the barriers which we discussed. While listening, do not uh, glance or turn your head here and there because it may distract the speaker. Do not interrupt the speaker halfway through of an idea or a concept which he is trying to convey. Don't jump to conclusion because sometimes the speaker may want to clarify some of the aspects in a later portion of the class, and so we are just wanting to jump ahead and ask for some additional clarification. This could interrupt the process of good communication. Here we come to the end of this communication theory lesson. I don't claim that it could have been greatly interesting or something. Nevertheless, if you were to learn, if you want to learn more in detail, there are very, very interesting aspects to communication. And there's much, much more to learn and understand on this aspect of communication, because since this remains a very the very medium in which interaction takes place. Anyway, so in our next lesson, we are going to talk about communication in aviation, which will be more relevant and which will be more interesting. So once again, I thank you all for going through the lesson patiently, and feel free to offer your critical comments at the mail ID given below. Thank you.